everybody, this is Ishtar with another episode of the Naked Shaman. I hope you can hear me okay. It's difficult for me to modulate my voice because my ears are blocked up with some god-awful gunge of some kind or another that my body's trying to clear. So I was even thinking of not doing an episode until I felt better, but having said that, I've had a couple of very intense shamanic journeys over the last few days, which I kind of need to get the stuff out while it's still fresh, because this stuff is like bread, it can go stale very quickly. I want to talk today about the Book of Revelations and its symbolic meaning, and I think it's very important to do so at this time, because it's at this time when we've got all the war drums being beaten by the usual suspects, to the tune of end of days and revelations. Particularly in America, I know they're really suffering from that kind of mind programming at the moment. That the end of days is coming and it's going to bring the second coming of the Saviour, and all of these false ideas which are built on the literalisation of a magical tract, actually. And so I want to talk today a little bit about my realisations on some of the magic that's in Revelations, which is actually alchemical and also based on numerology. I'm going to make it as simple as well to understand as possible. But we have to really start, recognising this kind of mind programming when it comes up, even if we don't really understand all the nuts and bolts of it, because we in a very difficult position in order to do so. The miseducation and diseducation of the last few hundred years have rendered us completely ignorant of the wisdom that our ancestors had and talked about and passed along in metaphorical or allegorical myth. And these myths have been taken and literalized and turned into a literal story in order to control us. And I've talked in many different episodes about this, so I probably won't have to go into too much detail about how the texts were literalized. But I think it's important for us to know the date that they were literalized, because if you read Wikipedia on the dating of the New Testament, it's very much influenced by Christian thinking that Jesus was a man who lived and died on earth. I don't believe that he was. I believe that, again, this is a literalization of magical texts, astrological texts, in the story of Jesus and his 12 disciples. There are lots of books that have been written about that, and so I won't go into too much about that today, but one very good one is The Jesus Mysteries by Peter Gandy and Timothy Freak. That's a very good condensation of this way of thinking if you want to grab it quickly. I mean, it took me years of research to actually get to this point, and then I found Gandy and Freak's book, and I was really annoyed because I thought, oh my God, I only had to read this book and I would have got to the same place. But then I'm glad I had to find it all myself, because then you really do own the information when you find it that way, and it's just not a question of believing what you read in a book. You should never believe what you read in any book, even mine, but it's what, you've got to believe in your own journey, what you find on your own journey. Having said that, most people have kind of got this now, that the Bible is a conglomerate, not a conglomeration, what's the word? But they brought together many magical tracts, astrological, alchemical, numerological, and they are basing the history of the Jewish people on them and our own history up to the present day. So we need to know at least what we're being fooled by, and that book does give you some very good pointers about what was going on in Rome at the time that the New Testament was put together. The New Testament, I'm just going to briefly do this dating thing because I think you'll find it useful, and particularly when we get into Revelations, which was written around 64 AD or CE, Common Era, AD meaning Anno Domini, after Christ, which I'm going to talk about. So how do we date the birth of Christ? Let's first of all look at that. Well, actually, the birth of Christ wasn't, dated as year 1. It's not called year 0 AD, it's called year 1, until the 6th century by a monk of the name of Dionysus, which is a nice non-Christian name, of a Greek god, the Greek god of ecstasy. And this monk's name was Dionysus Exiguus, and he was from the city of Tomist in Scythia, which is now Constanta in Romania. He's one of the Scythian monks, but I would say if he had a name like that, he was probably into some pretty strong mystic stuff. And to be believing in the literalization of the birth of Christ was probably his job, was to do this. And he didn't have to believe it himself, because a lot of the monks were very mystic and druidic, if you like, is another way of looking at it, in their thinking. But they had to kind of propagate a much more literal message, as we've discussed before. So he plumped on this date, and he decided that must be when Jesus was born, and he made that year 1. And so we're now in 2015 years since that year 1, which was almost, we don't know how he came to that number, but if you actually look at archaeology and history and linguistics and genetics and all the other now means we have of dating things, there's no evidence that there was anyone like Jesus is described in the Bible, let's say, in Jerusalem at that time or ever. Anyway, he decided that was going to be the date, and that this is where the dating system that we're in today comes from. But although he decided this in the 6th century, it wasn't really picked up until the 8th century, and it was picked up by the Venerable Bede, and he used it to date the events in his ecclesiastical history of the English people. And so until the 8th century, nobody really had this date in their mind at all, that there was a man who was born in Jerusalem at that time and who died on the cross for our sins and performed miracles. There was no date for that. So then we think, okay, so when was the New Testament dated to? And again, as I say, if you look on Wikipedia, the New Testament is dated as if Jesus did live in 1 AD to 33 AD, and then everything is then read as history and dated from then. So it's difficult, again, to get a firm date on it. But we do know that the New Testament is based on 2 codexes. Actually, there's a third one, but I can't remember the name of it. But there's 2 at least. One's called Codex Sinaitus, Mount Sinai comes from, and Codex Vaticanus, which comes from the Vatican, which was probably the Clementine wrote that one. Clement of Rome. They're dated to early 4th century. So this is still very late. So even if you do believe that Jesus was in Jerusalem in the year 1 AD to 33 AD, or CE as we call it now, Common Era, nothing was actually written down until the early 4th century. Or nothing, let's put it like this, if something was written down, it's been lost. The only evidence, firm evidence that we have are these 2 codexes which contain the writings which now we call the Gospels and the New Testament. So let's look at the Gospels. When the Gospels really are 4 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and they were again based on much older Gnostic texts, mystic texts, in which Jesus was much more, or the Christ, let's say, was much more of a other dimensional being, a spirit, if you like. These Gnostic Gospels are dated to the 2nd century, and they were discovered in the last century, buried in a cave in what's now the Egyptian desert. And they're called the Nag Hammadi Gospels. So if you want to Google them, and I'll put a link anyway, you can read these Gospels that were written before the first Gospels were actually literalized by 2 people, both with highly suspect Roman-sounding names, Bishop Irenaeus, who was the Bishop of Lyon in France, and another chap called Polycarp, nice Latin Roman name there, from Smyrna, which is now modern Turkey. these two people between them were the first people to literalize these metaphorical stories that the New Testament is made up of. And this was in the late 1st century, 2nd century AD, if you want to use that term. So these dates may seem not important, but when we talk about revelations, you'll see how important they are. Because if you can date when something was written, then that gives you half a clue as to why the person was writing it and what they were all about. And that helps us to understand it. So let's go to Revelations now. And in the last episode of The Naked Shaman, I read you something from D.H. Lawrence. Because the thing that gets most people in Revelations is this story of the whore of Babylon riding on the back of the beast. This has been portrayed as the epitome of all evil, when in fact it is just part of a cosmological alchemical process called the marriage of the sun and the moon that is at the heart of all creation. There is nothing that moves or grows or exists on this earth that hasn't come from this marriage of the sun and the moon, or alchemical marriage. And it takes place not just in this dimension, but it's a multi-dimensional marriage that takes place that some shamans know about. So I want to read you this again from D.H. Lawrence. And he's written a foreword to a book by Frederick Carter, which I haven't read, called The Dragon of Revelations. But I feel sure, knowing what D.H. Lawrence is saying, that this Frederick Carter probably has already found the alchemical meaning of Revelations. So he says, the apocalypse began about 2 centuries before Christ. Now remember, D.H. Lawrence is writing at a time before it was much more widely understood that Christ was metaphorical, not literal. So by 2 centuries before Christ, he means 2 centuries BC. So the apocalypse probably began about 2 centuries BC as some small book, perhaps a pagan ritual, or some small Jewish apocalypse written in symbols. It was written by other Jewish apocalypts and finally came down to John of Patmos. He turned it more or less rather than more, into a Christian allegory, and later scribes trimmed up his work. So the ultimate intentional Christian meaning of the book is, in a sense, only plastered over. Now this is the important bit that I want you to hear. The great images incorporated are like the magnificent Greek pillars plastered into the Christian church in Sicily. They are not merely allegorical figures, they are symbols, and they belong to a bigger age than that of John of Patmos. So in other words, actually John of Patmos, in his trying to understand a vision that he had, took some pre-existing Jewish writings which were meant to be metaphorical and made them literal. And so what was the literal story that he was misunderstanding, and what were the alchemical symbols? That's what we really need to break down. I really first of all want to do the etymology of the word apocalypse, because that again is a word that's been misunderstood, and I think if we know the etymology of that and the original meaning of apocalypse, it will help us again to understand the magical meaning of revelations, in that it literally is that a revelation of something that was hidden. So it comes from the word cover or conceal, and there is actually a Greek goddess called Calypso who is about covering and concealing. But later on in Middle English it meant insight, vision, hallucination, and this is important to us. And it only later became to mean a cataclysmic event. Sorry about that. A cataclysmic event in modern times. And this is because the only reason apocalypse is now thought of as a cataclysm is because of this literal interpretation of the magical text, or the magical hallucinations, visions and insights that John of Patmos had as he was in exile in his cave in Patmos. I mean, there are some that believe the vision came on because of magic mushrooms or some kind of wheat hallucinogen. I don't think it's necessary for him to have ingested anything to have this revelation. Even today, as part of shamanic training retreats, we go on something called a vision quest, and we go off by ourselves into the hills, into the forest, into the mountains, and we don't take any food with us. We just take some water, perhaps a bottle of water, and we stay there for 3 or 4 days, just meditating, journeying, communing with nature. In other words, we're fasting in the wilderness, and this does bring on amazing visions. There's something that happens physiologically when we fast in such conditions. I don't think it's just the fasting that brings it on. I think it's the desire as well to commune with the spirits of nature and the prayers that we make to the spirits of nature to reveal themselves to us. And yes, there are shortcuts to this revelation, and we often hear of people that go off to the Amazonian rainforest, for example, to work with the shamans there, and they are given ayahuasca, which is an hallucinogen. And this is a shortcut. You just you take the ayahuasca along with something called datura, and within probably an hour, you're having very similar revelations to the ones that John of Patmos had. But if you are not prepared for those revelations, if you come to those revelations with an unreconstructed Christian literal mindset, they probably will completely terrorize you, because you will suddenly be meeting these archetypes. You will meet horned archetypes, and to the Christians, the devil is horned. So you might think you're meeting devils and demons. You will also very early on meet reptilian gods and goddesses. And so if you think dragons and serpents are evil, as the Christians have taught us, you will obviously then think that you're in the presence of such great evil. And I think this really tells us a lot about where John of Patmos was coming from. John of Patmos was in a very difficult position as well geopolitically. He had been banished, he'd been exiled from Rome by the Roman Emperor Diocletian, because Diocletian wanted all the Christians in Rome to bow down and worship him as God. And the story is given to us that the Christians that didn't bow down to Diocletian were fed to the lions, because they would not replace him with Jesus. They wanted to bow down to Jesus. But it wasn't Jesus as a literal person that lived and died on the cross. It was the Jesus that they knew, who we can see in the Gnostic Gospels, lives in other dimensions. It's the spirit of Jesus. That was their spirit guide that they had contacted in the other dimensions. And when you read these Gnostic Gospels, which were hidden at the same time that this great purge came in, where Christianity had to become literalized, you'll see that Jesus doesn't live on earth, that he lives in the other dimensions. And even today, shamans have met Jesus there, and I have met him there myself. He is a very definite spirit, just as Ishtar is, just as so many of these gods and goddesses that we've come to know the names of. They exist in the other dimensions. They never did exist on earth. So let's start looking at the first bit of Revelations then, which really bothers us, bothers most people. And it is about the woman. Let's say Revelations 12, verse 1. By the way, I'm taking all this from the King James Bible, because to me there's no better Bible that we have. The others are really so translated out of, there's not, let's say, I don't think the King James First Bible is the original by any means, but it's the closest we can get, the closest I've managed to get. And there's a very good version of it that was published by the Oxford and Cambridge Press in 1951. And I find it really, really helpful, because They have sort of little readings for you to read between parts of the Bible, explaining when things were written and why they were written. And it seems to me they were written by people with really level heads. So I definitely would recommend it. Mine's really old; it's falling apart, and I kind of got it all stuck up with gaffer tape. But there's probably a newer one that you can get. I like this one because it was published in 1951, which was the year I was born. So that's really nice. Anyway, so all the quotes are coming from there. Revelations 12. And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. Well, when we understand astrology, alchemy, and numerology, this makes sense. This is Ishtar, the daughter of the moon god, crowned with the 12 signs of the zodiac and blazing forth from her inner sun. And even John says that he absolutely admired her when he saw her. He doesn't, describe her as someone to be frightened of. He said, I can't find it now. Anyway, he does say that he viewed her with great admiration. So, and it sounds very similar to the same woman that's in the Song of Songs. This is another book in the Old Testament. The Song of Songs 6:10. Who is she that looketh forth at the morning, fair as the moon, clear as the sun, and terrible as an army with banners? I think that's very similar. It brings forth the beauty and the terror of the great beauty if you're unprepared for it. There are actually 3 women in Revelations, and we're very familiar with the 3 faces of the goddess, or the 3 Marys of the Christian tradition, or the maiden, mother and crone of the moon. The 3-faced woman is very familiar to us as the same woman in 3 different guises. And so that's another huge key there for us. But what trips us up about in Revelations more than anything is the beast. We are so worried about this woman riding on the beast. And the beast has been given the number of 666, which we've been told is the devil. And to the Christians and to the Jews probably, 666, would make sense as the devil. But the serpent is the devil. The serpent was demonized from the book of Genesis onwards, in the Garden of Eden, where he tempts Eve. Or she, actually, I think. I don't know if it was a he or she, it's not really clear. But the serpent tempts Eve with the apple. And from then on, all the problems of the world that have come down to us to the present day have happened all because of that. And, so you have to think, oh, come on, what is it about this serpent? Why are you really demonizing this serpent so much? And it's because when you want to change a religion, you have to demonize all the previous gods of the previous religion, just as Zoroaster did. Zoroaster was a Vedic priest, and in the Vedic tradition, the Devas are the nature spirits, the good spirits, but he turned them into demons when he wanted to create Zoroastrianism. And this is what always happens. You take the gods and you say, no, they are evil, you've got to follow our new gods. It's done over and over again. In fact, in the ancient world, the world that D.H. Lawrence is referring to, a much greater time, a much older time than John of Patmos, the serpent was worshipped. The serpent was worshipped all over the world as the epitome of wisdom. And this is something to do with cycles of, serpents are used to in art to show cycles. And if you understand universal cycles, you understand natural law, then you understand wisdom. That's what wisdom is. And therefore, once you understand these natural laws, you start to see patterns occurring. And so you know what's going to happen next. And then you can prophesy. And then people think you're a great prophet and you must be close to God. And all these things they think about the Old Testament prophets. All it is if you're a great prophet, you just have wisdom. You have wisdom because you can read patterns. So when one thing happens, you know something is going to happen next. For instance, if you were to put your finger in the fire, as you're walking towards the fire with your finger, I know you're going to scream very loudly within 2 seconds. It's as simple as that. It's a natural law. If you put your finger in the fire, it will burn really bad and you will scream. But if I was to say to you, in 3 seconds' time, you're going to scream, would I be called a great prophet? No, I just understand natural laws. And there are many books in the Bible that are, and they are called the wisdom teachings, the Song of Songs being one of them, otherwise known as the Song of Solomon. These are great wisdom teachings that teach these cosmological laws, but the cosmological laws are multidimensional. So not only do you understand the natural law of this world, but you understand how this world interacts with all the other worlds, all the other dimensions, and that makes you wise and that makes you a great seer because you can predict things. So the serpent is of that other dimension, and the serpent brings the seed of the conception in the divine marriage. The divine marriage in sacred geometry has come down to us as the Vesica Pisces, and that's why you often see that that almond shape at the centre. I'll put some pictures up of the Vesica Pisces at this stage of the talk so you can see what it's like, but it is 2 circles interlapping basically, and where they interlap it creates what's known as the mandorla. Mandorla is the Italian word, the Latin word for almond, because it creates an almond shape, but this almond shape is also the shape of the female vulva, and the vulva is the heart of creation. It's the gateway, it's Ishtar's gate of the creation, gateway to the heart of creation. And so through that gateway comes the child, and the child has been described as the Christ, of Mary and Joseph in the divine marriage, except there was a serpent there too. So Mary represented the moon in that marriage, and Joseph represented the sun. So where was the serpent? The cedar. Where was the serpent? Well, we think it's Gabriel, who's been turned into an angel. And this is why, there's this whole thing about Joseph not being the father, but actually Gabriel, he's actually from a divine source. He's from Gabriel, because when you have this marriage of the sun and the moon, it always has to be someone from this dimension with someone in another dimension. It's interdimensional marriage. And this is the source of all creation. And it's also the source of sovereignty. Those that take part in these rites are the kings and queens, the natural kings and queens of the whole of creation. And this goes back to the episode before last when I did the awakening of the dark queens on the astral planes, because the queens of these partnerships are now waking up to the fact that they've been somehow kidnapped, captured, to bring sovereignty. When I'm talking about the queens of the astral planes and waking up to the fact that we're queens, the women amongst us that are waking up to this, it's not about being a queen in this dimension. It's not about being Queen Elizabeth I, Queen Elizabeth II. The real queens are hidden, and unfortunately haven't been hidden to those that want to use them. And if you read the story of Revelations, it is about how that sovereignty has been kidnapped, has been usurped, and how that sovereignty was used to seed the Empire of Rome. And the number 666, which it even says in my King James Bible, because this was published before they had this need to create Revelations as part of the PSYOP, is in Hebrew numerology, the number 666 is Nero Caesar. And Nero Caesar was the first Roman emperor to send the mystic Jews into the lion's den, because they wouldn't worship him as God. And Domitian after him did the same, and it was Domitian that sent John of Patmos to the island in exile, so because he wouldn't worship the emperor as God. And this has gone on and on through history of kings trying to usurp the place of the goddess, basically, and misusing the sovereignty rights to do so. I hate to keep plugging my book because it sounds like I'm trying to sell my book, The Sacred Sex Rites of Ishtar. And yes, I mean, it would be nice to sell a few books, I'm not saying that, but if you would read it, if any of this is ringing a bell with you, if you would read it, this would give you a much better foundation to understand what I'm talking about with the alchemical marriage in relation to sovereignty. It took me a whole half of a book to describe it, so I'm not going to be able to explain it adequately today to someone coming to it completely fresh. But I do describe it in that book, and people tell me that it's very easy to understand, very simply written. But it's a lot of information that you need because we have not been given this information. It's been hidden, it's been occulted, all of this information, which I am now bringing out of hiding in a revelation, in an apocalypse of new learning here today. So this is the great mystery, and when he sees this vision of Ishtar on the beach, he also sees written there these words: mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And immediately, the unreconstructed Christian mindset's going to go, oh my God, she was a common prostitute and she's into abominations. God knows what she was into. And, it completely is not what that is about. So let's look at the etymology of the word abomination. It has come to mean a really abominable thing, a feeling of disgust, hatred, loathing that we get from viewing something abominable, horror, repugnance, disgust. But it actually comes from a much older word that actually meant something away from man in Latin. The original Latin comes from ab homine. Ab means away from, like nothing to do with, not to do with man. And homine means man. Ab homine, away from man. And because in this, world that we live in, man is now seen as the crown of creation, and the beasts of the field are seen as stupid, unintelligent beings with no wisdom. Therefore, abomination means something beastly. Are you following? I hope you're following this. It's actually described it actually means, all it means is away from man, it just means not in this dimension. It means in another dimension, not the dimension of man. But you see, man thinks he's the crown of creation, and this is all the creation that there is, that he can see. So therefore it has become to mean something repugnant, something beastly. It just means it doesn't fit into the normal cognitive patterns that we've been taught to have. It's irregular, it's an irregular geometrical shape. And there's another book called Flatland, A Romance of Many Dimensions, and this was published in 1885, and it's a very good book. I read it a long time ago and I'd sort of forgotten about it, and I came across this quote again from it while I was doing the research for this talk. So Edwin Abbott writes in Flatland, because he's saying that this is flatland, this cognitive world that we live in is completely flat, and we won't recognise anything as having any value unless it's flat, 2D, it's a 2D world. And when we're talking about 5 dimensions, 6 dimensions, we're talking about then something completely ab homine, away from man. The 2D man cannot recognise this in his flatland. And so he writes, doubtless, the life of an irregular is hard, but the interests of the greater number require that it shall be hard. If a man with a triangular front and a polygonal back was allowed to exist and to propagate a still more irregular posterity, what would become of the arts of life? Are the houses and doors and churches in Flatland to be altered in order to accommodate such monsters? And this so sums up the position any, practicing shaman finds himself in today. It's like increasingly we become more and more, as we practice, more like this irregular. And We don't fit into the houses and doors and churches in Flatland anymore, and the Flatland people know we don't, and they tend to repel us and think we're repellent and repugnant. So then this is like looking at what these words mean and then understanding what we don't already understand, and that's about the multidimensional aspect to it. And once we get that, then we can start to pull it apart for ourselves. I mean, there's so much numerology in there, in Revelations, and I mean, some of it's really obvious. It's based on well-known numerology. For example, the number 144, 12 times 12. I think it's 144,000 people are only going to be saved, and it's 12 times 12. And then there's lots of 12s in there, and it's all astrological anyway. And then the other numbers in there that crop up a lot is the number 20, and the number 20 is the key number in Solomon's temple. And again, I did a long time ago, and I don't know, I had to look for it earlier, but I can't find it. I did take apart the numerology of Solomon's temple at one time, and if I can find it, I'll post it. But basically, it's very much based on the number 20. And by the way, anyone quoting David Cameron saying the other day that we would take in, I think, what was it? He said we will take in 20,000 refugees by the year 2020. Well, anyone who knows the numbers of Solomon knows that's the number of the Temple of Solomon. So you could say it's a coincidence, but I doubt it. If you look at Chronicles 2, I got the quote here for you in 3:3. The length by cubits after the ancient measure was 70 cubits, and the breadth 20 cubits. So 70, that's 3 times 20 cubits, and the breadth was 20 cubits. And the porch that was before the house, the length of it, according to the breadth of the house, was 20 cubits, and the height 120. So, and it was overlaid with pure gold. We have to really understand what these numbers mean, and it's a journey for all of us, and I'm only really just starting to make this journey with the numbers. I've been mainly concentrating on alchemy and astrology. So I don't want to say this means this and this means that, because all I want to do is open the door and say, let's go in here. Let's start looking at these things from another point of view, because the old point of view, I tell you what, I don't like it, the old point of view, because it leads to World War III. So there must be another and a better way of understanding what we need to understand. Understanding what has been lost, what has been hidden. Let's have a real apocalypse. Let's understand who this woman is. Let's understand what sovereignty is. Sovereignty is epitomized by so many of the goddesses that have come down to us in the stories, in the ancient stories, and every civilization on earth had these stories that were orally passed on, that were never written down. And they featured the Queen of Heaven was Ishtar in Babylon. The Queen of Heaven in Egypt was Isis. The Queen of Heaven in the Middle East was Astarte. In the Celtic mythology, we have Rhiannon. In the Indian mythology, we have Radha. These are all the divine feminine, the female principle of the divine marriage, which is the marriage of the sun and the moon and the serpent. And we mustn't forget the serpent. So I probably have said more than enough today. There's much more I could say, but I think there's a lot there and a lot for people to be thinking about. As I said, I don't want to give away everything that I know, because this is a journey for you to make. And I want to just give out keys and say, take these keys and think about them and think about things from a different angle. And you'll get then your own revelation, your own apocalypse. And so I wish you joy of that with much love. Talk to you next time again.